Now, many of you may be familiar with the Batavia Story and that of the Dutch East India Company's flagship, but the infamy of the events that were first popularized in a 17th century publication were never forgotten, and more than 330 years later, the shipwreck and its associated sites continue to reveal secrets of the past. So the investigation into the wrecking of Batavia and the subsequent mutiny is a story that continues to define Western Australia in terms of its relationship with the Netherlands and Europe, as well as domestically, with a raft of local characters, including avocationals, academics, and everyday people alike. Now, today's talk will revisit this tragic story and share with you the last 60 years of research, excavation, and analyses, and summarize work from dozens of researchers over the years. So please note the majority of this work is not mine specifically, but that of the Western Australian museums who have led us to the point today. As this is the first thing in the morning for many of you, and you may be enjoying your morning cup of tea, I thought I should let you know that this presentation does include images of human remains. So if you don't have that iron stomach this early in the morning, just please take note. Now, in the early 1600s, the VOC pioneered a shorter southern Indian Ocean route to reach Batavia. That's present-day Jakarta, Indonesia, called the Brouwer Route. So they would shoot down the western coast of the African continent around the Cape of Good Hope and hopefully catch the strong westerly winds between 40 and 50 degrees south before heading north up towards the Spice Islands. Now this aimed to reduce the length of the voyage. However, without the ability to calculate longitude, there was a greater chance for missing the mark. 4 Dutch East India Company vessels, so that's Batavia, Verwolderdrecht, Zoutdorp, and Zeewijk, as well as the English East Indiaman Trial, wrecked along the western coast of Australia. Now, Batavia, a flagship of the VOC, left Amsterdam on the 29th of October in 1628 en route to Batavia, Indonesia, with 341 people on board under the command of Francisco Pelsart and skippered by Adrian Jacobs. Jeronimus Cornelius was the next most senior on board, serving as the undermerchant. What happened during that journey was recorded in Pelsart's journal and would go on to become a 17th century bestseller called The Unlucky Voyage, which ran for 9 pirated editions. Unfortunately, Pelsart fell ill for a portion of the journey, and when the vessel left the Cape of Good Hope, it only had 322 people on board. And little did he know, soon thereafter, a mutiny, led by Cornelius, the undermerchant, was already underway. On the 4th of June, 1629, Batavia struck Morning Reef in the Wallaby group of the Abrolhos Islands, approximately 30 nautical miles off the Australian mainland. Of the 282 people who survived the wrecking event itself, most ended up on Beacon Island, a small waterless coral shingle island, better known to the survivors as Batavia's Graveyard. According to Pelsart's journal, immediately following the shipwreck, a party of approximately 40 cabin boys, men and women, were sent to Long Island to search for water. So that's the island directly to the left of Beacon Island, or to the west. 4 days after wrecking, the freshwater supplies were running low, and Commander Pelsart, along with Skipper Jacobs and 46 others, set sail in an open boat towing a yawl in search of fresh water off the coast of Western Australia. They encountered what they call an inhospitable coast and were unable to find water. So they decided to set sail to the remaining 900 miles to Batavia and the East Indies in search of help. They left nearly 200 people behind. Now, with Pelsart and company away, Cornelius seizes power over the remaining survivors, and his aim was to get rid of those people who might pose a threat. So this included those who may be loyal to Pelsart and those men and boys who may pose a more physical threat. Although Beacon Island was the main campsite for the survivors and the venue for much of the mutiny, the violence quickly escalated and soon spread to Long Island and the other surrounding islands, creating a more complex network of interrelated sites. 17 days after Pelsart left, of the 40 who were sent to Long Island, all except 7 boys and some women were murdered, and these subsequently suffering the same fate shortly thereafter. Pelsart, Jacobs, and company arrived in Batavia 1 month after setting off in search of water, but the Governor General Cohen directed Pelsart to return immediately on the vessel Sardam to rescue the survivors and recover the company's goods. Unfortunately, it took them another 2 months before they found their way back to the Wallaby group of islands in the Abrolhos. Pelsart returned in September of 1629, and after learning of the mutiny, captured the principal mutineers and other accomplices and ordered them to be taken to Long Island for security, pending their interrogation on Beacon Island. Following the confessions of their crimes, and many confessions were given under duress, the condemned mutineers were sentenced to having their right hand cut off, and in the case of Cornelius, both hands, prior to be putting death on the gallows. And Long Island was the place designated for the execution, and this was carried out on the 2nd of October in 1629. Of the 322 who left the Cape of Good Hope, only 122 would actually make it to the East Indies. So that's a happy way to start your morning. Let's continue on to the Batavia and its discovery. So the historical background to the Batavia story does not end with the trial and execution on Long Island. By the 19th century, a new group of scientific and commercial operators were investigating the Abrolhos. And although at this time it was believed that Batavia had wrecked further to the south in what we call the Pelsart group, contemporarily, American and French ships cruised through the region, exploiting the whale and seal populations, which frequented the archipelago. We have Stokes aboard HMS Beagle, which arrived in 1840, naming West Wallaby Island. And later on, many of the islands were mined by colonial interests for the deposits of guano. As Beacon Island appears to have negligible guano deposit, it escaped that wholesale removal of its surface, which has scarred many of the other sites in the area. Lacking any other obvious attractions, including wood or fresh water, it's possible that Beacon Island would have seen very few visitors. And there's only one main exception, and this is in 1877, when the survivors of the wreck of the guano ship Hatta, which wrecked just off of Beacon Island, they lived on the island for about 5 days before being rescued. Now this beautiful image here just gives you a bird's eye view of the topography of Beacon Island, and you can see the fishers' huts just along here. And these were built during the mid-late 20th century. Now the story of Batavia fell into obscurity except for a few interested Western Australians. And it was the work of historian and author Henrietta Drake Brockman that was the first driving force behind the relocation of the shipwreck search. From Pelsart group, she's suggested moving it up to the Wallaby group. Now the first known discovery of material relating to the Dutch occupation of Beacon Island was in 1960. This is when Pop Martin unearthed human bones near one of the fishers' huts. And it was several months before these were actually confirmed as being human. And even then, their association was initially thought to be with that 19th century activities and with the Hatta survivors. Hugh Edwards, a journalist with the Western Australian newspapers, visited the islands in the same year and excavated in the hopes that the discovery might actually be associated with the Batavia incident. We have Max Kramer along with Hugh Edwards and a team of divers who found and initiated the underwater excavation of the wreck. But towards the end of their expedition in the 60s, they excavated several areas on Beacon Island. And you can see the image on your screen of the material that they recovered. They unearthed in the sandy interior of the island more burials and the remains of survivors' camps. But unfortunately, there's no recorded methodology for the early 1960s excavations, and it's difficult to actually relate any of this material to any archaeological context. So here we see Hugh Edwards and Henrietta Drake Brockman in that middle image, and they're examining a cut mark in a skull, which exhibits sharp force trauma. Now this happens to be a male aged 20 to 34 years, and this individual is currently on display at the WA Shipwrecks Museum in Fremantle in Western Australia. This is another individual exhibiting signs of blunt force trauma to the head. In this case, the skull was exhumed in 1964, but the rest of the body, the postcranial skeleton, was entombed under a concrete slab of one of the fishers' huts. In 1970, I should say, the WA Museum and its newly formed Maritime Archaeology Department comes on board with the pioneering excavation of the wreck site, which was led by Jeremy Green. The museum also conducted some terrestrial excavations during this time, but the main focus was the wreck site itself. And here we can see the uncovered hull remains tagged and recorded in situ prior to recovery. And then the following 2 decades, the WA Museum spent cataloging, conserving, and displaying the material recovered from the wreck site and the associated land sites, which, to be honest, is actually still an ongoing process. And if you haven't already, when you get the chance, COVID permitting, of course, come and visit the WA Shipwrecks Museum in Fremantle, Western Australia. The Batavia Hall, the hull itself looks absolutely impressive on display. Another spectacular recovery from the wreck site were the portico building blocks and the door pintles. Now, these blocks were intended for the water port of the castle at Batavia in Indonesia. And that's, if you look at the bottom left of your screen, you'll see a drawing. And this portico would have had large wooden doors held up by these pintles. Now, the original portico has been reconstructed and can be seen in the WA Museum in Geraldton. And it's an incredible piece of portable architecture. Portable. We also have a life-size model of the portico on display at the WA Shipwrecks Museum in Fremantle. And you can see from the image on your right, this is life-size. It's quite a large piece of architecture. All right, 1990s onwards. So in the late 1980s, while on Beacon Island, some deckhands discovered a human mandible while digging a leach drain for a toilet behind one of the huts. And it wasn't reported until the Australian Historic Shipwrecks Amnesty in 1993. And this amnesty is when people could register objects that they previously salvaged from historic shipwreck sites. They could remain the custodian, not the owner, but it gave the Australian government an idea of what material was actually associated with these sites. A team from the museum, however, wasn't deployed to investigate for another 2 years. And they discovered the remains of 2 individuals, which they left in situ with a plan to return to complete a full excavation, but they weren't able to return until 1999. When the site of a mass grave comprising of 6 individuals was discovered. Now, some of these individuals were recovered with clothing and everyday items on their persons. So for example, a spoon, a thimble, and remains of jewelry. At the base of the mass grave, a large organic matrix, affectionately known and referred to as the blob, was discovered. It was left in situ until a team could return in 2001. The blob organic matrix contained buttons and bones, and the whole unit itself was removed as a singular artifact. It was x-rayed and excavated back at the WA Museum in Fremantle, and it was determined that it was primarily made from decomposing plant material and had lumps of gypsum within it. It's most likely that the deposition of 6 corpses on a sand coral island provided the perfect nutrient base for the salt bush to get its roots into. And then the presence of a modern pit toilet and leach drain directly adjacent may have also contributed to the accelerated nutrient loading in the soil. To this day, the remains of the blob still smell horrific. At the base of the pit, we found the 6th individual, an infant, only 8 to 9 months old. Now, as I mentioned, activities associated with the mutiny spread to the surrounding islands within the Wallaby group. Now you can see over here on your right, this is Beacon Island, and then here to your left in the middle of the screen, this is Long Island. It's a coral island approximately 1,600 meters long, and it is 180 meters at its widest point just up here in the northern extremity. Now, as outlined in Pelsard's journal, this is the location for 3 primary activities. We have the occupation and slaughter site of 40-some Batavia survivors. We have the mutineers' prisoner, and then we have the execution site of the Batavia mutineers. Now, the Western Australian Museum has conducted several surveys at Long Island from 2001 to the present. The surveys were predominantly visual, and although metal detectors were deployed, the survey areas were selective. High vegetation cover has prevented total visual and metal detection coverage on some parts of the island. We do have an obligation to the natural as well as the cultural features in the Abrolhos Islands, and we need to make sure that the natural habitats are not damaged while we conduct archaeological work. So the main 3 surveys were undertaken in 2001, 2005, and 2007. During the 2001 survey, we found this lead sheathing molded into a ball with square nail holes. And after careful examination, we suspect that this is probably used as a makeshift Morningstar weapon. We'd love to think that this is evidence of resistance rather than mutiny, but that is actually too difficult for us to tell, at least at this point. Following the 2005 survey, the museum pushed for national heritage listing of all of the Batavia-related sites in the Wallaby group of the Abrolhos Islands, and in 2006, that was actually granted. During the 2007 survey, we came across hundreds of ferrous wrought iron bolts and nails, which we believe to be the execution site for the tried mutineers. Now, two 2 by 3 meter areas were excavated, and the majority of ferrous material was found in the first 2 units. The deposit was primarily coral with a minor amount of soil in the upper units, and the fastenings and other metal material appeared to have fallen through the gaps of the coral over time. These fastenings are consistent with 17th to 19th century ship construction, and the nails have mainly square section shafts with cylindrical iron bolts, and cylindrical iron bolts. As you can see from the top left illustration, gallows were built, and considering the lack of resources on the island, they most likely would have recycled material from the shipwreck. This excavation also revealed lumps of melted lead as well as coal. And here's just a quick image of some of those numerous remnants of iron nail heads and shafts that were recovered. So you can see those square body shafts and then numerous round heads. Now, the site is consisted with the predicted remains of a gallows site, being a sufficiently large concentration and a range of iron fastenings, quite often used for fastening structural timber on pieces and possibly decking, were found in a concentrated area. Although historical evidence from Pelsard's journal does not indicate whether the mutineers were left on the gallows, it's highly unlikely that they were taken down and or buried after the execution. According to Dutch practice of the period, earth was not given or permitted for those who were executed. So we have that assumption that the individuals were left as a sign, a warning to others. Now we'll move on to West Wallaby Island now. Here we are at West Wallaby, and this is the island where Cornelius sent Webby Hayes, a soldier turned hero, with a party of people, primarily soldiers as well, in search of water in hopes that they would be unsuccessful and die of thirst. Charming, right? After searching for 20 days, the soldiers found 2 pits with fresh water, which rose and fell with the tide. The island also had good food resources in the forms of birds, fish, eggs, and what is recorded as cats, which are actually Tamar wallabies. Now, according to prior arrangements, the soldiers made 3 fires as signals, which Cornelius, who happened to be preoccupied with massacre at the time, disregarded. Meanwhile, several parties of 4 to 5 people escaped to Webby Hayes Island, or to West Wallaby Island, on rafts, until nearly 50 people were safely ashore. Now, after hearing about the developments on Batavia's graveyard, these individuals all prepared to defend themselves against attack, and they made weapons out of hoop iron and nails, which they bound to sticks. This is all recorded in Pelsard's journal. These survivors were attacked 3 times by the party of mutineers, but they did a pretty good job of protecting themselves. Now, unfortunately, between 1879 and the present day, an unknown amount of visitation and disturbance has occurred on the islands by guano miners, fishers, fossicers, and other casual visitors. And during the Australia's Historic Shipwrecks Amnesty in 1993, we had musket balls, lead artifacts, copper, an iron needle, homemade shoe buttons, what else? A uniform button, barrel hoop iron, and a variety of miscellaneous iron objects, which were all reported. But again, they're lacking archaeological context. Although it is known that these sites have been disturbed, in 2007, the WA Museum excavated the 2 limestone structures built on West Wallaby Island. And these are thought to be built by the soldiers, and if so, are the oldest European-built structures on the Australian continent. Objects contemporary with Dutch occupation were found outside the western end of the interior of the structure, as well as 19th century glass and ceramic artifacts, which are believed to be associated with the guano miners' occupation of the structure. And here's an example of some of the finer objects found in 2007. So the top left image is of a copper alloy decorated book clasp, which can be positively identified as 15th to 17th century Dutch in provenance, and this is similar to other book clasps which were recovered from the wreck site itself. This is quite a significant find in that it's the first archaeological provenance finding relating to the survivors' camp that indicates books were actually carried ashore and between islands. It also indicates a level of literacy and education held by at least 1 member of the survivors on West Wallaby, and So that's quite spectacular. The top right image is of a lace tie end, which can also be positively identified as 16th to 17th century Dutch in provenance. The artifact is a small rolled thin copper sheet. It's conical in shape, and for use, it would be used as a tie end on a shoe or clothing lacing to stop the fraying ends, similar to what we have on shoelaces today. Similar examples have been found on Batavia and in other Dutch contexts. The bottom right image shows two square lead objects, which are somewhat ambiguous. Now, these artifacts can be positively identified as 17th century Dutch in provenance and are similar to artifacts excavated from the Batavia wreck site itself, but their function is actually not certain. They could have been used as weights, such as for measuring rations. It's also possible that they're lead tokens or gaming pieces, but many of such contemporary identical examples that we've cross-referenced, they have some kind of scratches on them or crosses or markings on them, whereas these artifacts don't have any visible markings. So needless to say, it's a work in progress. Along with the forts, there are three structures interpreted as fireplaces on the east coast of Slaughter Point, and those would be those red dots on the farther east of the screen. They consist of limestone slabs that have been stood upright to form a three-sided protection from the wind. A number of wells have also been surveyed, and in total, an area of 1,500 square meters was surveyed to determine the presence of unexcavated cultural material relating to the Batavia period, and to make an assessment of the current archaeological potential and values of this land site. Now, approximately 20% of the targets were surface finds comprising modern material such as remnants of cans, bottle caps, and bullets. And I think that there were close to 50 targets in total. The remaining 80%, which comprise of metal anomalies situated on or below the surface soil, have not been recovered, and the remains, many of them remain unidentified to date. So there's still work to be done on West Wallaby, like many of the other islands. But here, and again, like many of the other islands, the natural habitat is quite important, and we have to be mindful of those birds and the wallabies and other animals and plants that are on the island. All right, so let's come into some more recent years. Fishing moved from a seasonal industry to a quota-based industry, and jet boats allow fishers to access the islands from Geraldton in just a few hours, so permanent camps on the island became redundant. In 2014, the Western Australian government negotiated a settlement to relocate the commercial lobster fishers from Beacon Island, and in June 2014, demolition of the modern structures began, and the industrial rubbish was removed, freeing up the island for archaeological investigation. It was the end of another era. The fishers had left Beacon Island, but what they had left behind was another layer to the very complex Batavia story. The relocation of the fishers was the impetus for researchers from 7 institutions to collaborate on the Australian Research Council funded Shipwrecks of the Roaring Forties project. And this was a maritime archaeological reassessment of some of those Australia's earliest shipwrecks. And it included, but was not limited to, Batavia and the Beacon Island. Roaring Forties partners instigated a geophysical survey program to better understand the subsurface deposits, the island formation, and to test for archaeological signatures on Beacon Island. A series of 5 field seasons were organized across several islands, not just Beacon, with the aim of revisiting known sites and materials with new technology and spatial material analyses. So, for example, we utilized 3D photogrammetry and virtual reality to capture sites. We revisited the skeletal remains using absolute dating, genetic and isotopic analyses. We did dendrochronology. We looked at, for the coins, for example, we looked at the chemical composition and underwent more historical research and so on. As part of this project, it was negotiated with the WA government to capture Beacon Island prior to the removal of the shacks, as these are now part of that historical record, and they leave their mark in and on the site and the story, really. So the result was the development of Beacon Virtua, and this is an immersive shipwreck experience that gives you, as the visitor, the chance to visit the island as it was in 2014 before the removal of the shacks. It provides a VR simulation that was developed in Unity 3D, and it combines a range of visualization methods, including but not limited to panorama bubbles, 3D of the shacks, CAD models, and so on. It also captures the sound of the island, which helps in telling the story for virtual tourism. And if you get a chance, go to that website, museum.wa.gov.au/beacon virtua, and investigate yourself. It can be used through a range of platforms, which is really handy. So it has a variety of purposes, from education to tourism to personal interest. And I'll give you a little bit of a peek. So since its inception, there have been upgrades, including a dive on the shipwreck itself, which gives that spatial relationship between the wrecking site and the island, as well as more views into these buildings. And I'll just quickly skip through so you get an idea. You see those little bubbles here? And we'll pop you through a bubble. And so this is a program that you can drive yourself. You can take tours. There's historical information provided. There are little information signs throughout, or you can just take a tour and pop in from shack to shack. The project also looked at using legacy photographs to create a 3D model of Batavia in situ. And this has actually turned out to be quite a useful exercise, because it's one we've applied subsequently to other shipwrecks and from other sites from the museum repertoire. One of the doctoral outputs from this ARC was Dr. Maddie McAllister's thesis on 3D recording and visualization of underwater shipwreck sites based on a lot of this legacy data. And we also therefore had that before and after excavation 3D. So you've just seen the in situ, and this is what the site looks like today. Now, the removal of the huts in 2014 exposed high areas which had not been previously surveyed. And although the initial aim of the ARC was to revisit the remains of the cultural material on Beacon Island to look for more signs of the survivors' camps, the first few new discoveries were skeletal. Now, the first human remains discovered as part of the Roaring Forties was the postcranial skeleton during the demolition of the huts in 2014. The skull for this individual was Beacon Island Body 4, BIB4, is the one that I mentioned earlier, that was recovered in 1964 and is exhibited in Geraldton. We were able to match the skull to the body because the fragment of the right temporal bone was actually found in association with the postcranial skeleton. This unequivocally matches a defect in the cranial vault of the 1964 skull on display. And it's evident that this was a sharp trauma at the time of death. We also have learned that the individual appears to have been dragged into the shallow grave as the right arm is pulled above the head, and you can see that here. Further excavation in the area revealed more cultural material directly above the burial. So we had animal bones, glass fragments, musket balls, and the musket balls were not necessarily the cause of death. They may have been in the pocket of the victim. There were also these beautiful tiny fossilized resin beads, which were found in the sieve residue. And they're beautiful. Interestingly, 2 sections of clay pipe were also found in this area, and they point to a habitation site. The section of pipe is inscribed with Dougal, which is McDougall of Glasgow, and this is a cutty-style pipe dating from 1847, when the company first started, until about 1891. Now, such an object would have been in use at the time of the wrecking of Hatta in 1877, so we may be looking at part of the survivors' camp from the guano miners. As a result of the huts being removed, it was an opportune time to survey the exposed areas before the revegetation began. Now, 3 geophysical techniques were employed. We used ground penetrating radar, GPR, and then we underwent a magnetometer and conductivity surveys. And the goal was mapping the 2D, 3D spatial distribution of numerous physical properties to better indicate where that cultural material may be found on the island. These maps were then used to infer the geological and subsurface structure, so such as the resource deposits, and then they helped narrow down localized anomalies. So we were looking to differentiate between the skeletal remains in coarse beach sand and magnetized objects. When the three data sets were integrated, there was no standout anomalies, but rather subtle variations. And one of the main issues was the location of the near surface metal material, which was probably modern, which correlates to all three data sets. And you can see these targets pictured were deemed, so A, B, and C here, and these were deemed the most geophysically interesting. But it was a single tooth discovered on the surface in area A that persuaded us to dig in this region. And here are some of my lovely colleagues, happy to be out in the elements, digging away and sifting away. Now, these give you an idea of what it looks like from the ground, and you can see the vegetation in the background. There's not a lot here on the island. So it was thus our aim in terms of the skeletal research to try and identify age using detention, growth and ossification, and epiphyses and degeneration features, and also to determine sex by the skull and pelvis mainly. We were also interested, or we are interested in the pathology. So the health and cause of death of these individuals. We therefore looked at the ante, post, and peri-mortem, and then used isotopic analyses to look at the diet and provenance, with the results of this actually being finalized and published in the coming week or so. The first skeleton recovered in 2015 is BIB11, Beacon Island Body 11. And this is a juvenile male, I believe, approximately 15 years old. Now this was found at 1.4 meters. So this is quite a deep burial when compared to the mass grave reported in the 1990s, as well as the other individuals who were uncovered in less than 50 centimeters of sediment. This individual exhibits staining and degradation as a result of being in the tidal range, so that water movement that's happening. And it's quite incomplete when compared to the other skeletons, as the water has eroded the organic components of the bone. Immediately north of Beacon Island Body 11 led to the discovery of two further individuals, and these were in a commingled burial, so one directly on top of the other. These were designated BIB 12 and 13 respectively. BIB 12 is likely a male, 20 to 34 years old, is 1.68 meters tall, and is petite in build compared to his shipmate BIB 4, that 1964 recovery. BIB 13 was likely female, also 20 to 34 years old and 1.6 meters tall. And you can see by the arms crossed over her abdomen that this is a deliberate burial as opposed to that of BIB 4, whose arm was found overhead. I'll just give you a little view. So here you can see the stratigraphy of the site, as well as that spatial relationship between these three individuals. Evidence of associated cultural material was also found with BIB 13. And if you see here, you notice this green staining right here. This would have come from a copper or a copper alloy object in the grave. Now these clasps were from clothing or vestments and were also found in this combined grave. And this is amazing. We found textiles associated with this individual, which is pretty spectacular considering the environment. We also found a comb found in association with BIB 13. And this is similar to a comb that was recovered in the 1974 Batavia excavation from the wreck site itself. Interestingly, many of the teeth and bone that were recovered from Area A do not actually appear to belong to any of these three individuals. That suggests that it's possible there may have once been another individual or more individuals, or there is yet undiscovered graves in close proximity. The mutton birds on the island burrow and nest in the ground, and thus they transport those smaller fragments and small bones. So it's also possible that they could have come from elsewhere on the island. The following year, in 2016, we went back to Area A on Beacon Island and uncovered yet another individual, BIB 14. And this is a male. He was also found at 1.4 meters depth. He's 45 to 50 years old. Again, is 1.68 meters in stature. What's really interesting about this was adjacent to BIB 14 was the remains of a juvenile Australian sea lion skeleton. So similar to previous burials excavated on the island, the coral beds themselves define the base of the burial. So the sea lion bones next to this individual provided an opportunity for dating by association, really. And the radiocarbon dating places a CO between 500 to 370 BP, which suggests that we actually have an archaeological evidence for contemporary animal remains associated with the Batavia survivors. So they could have been living off of the seals. And here we have Jeremy Green showing off the Majolica jar found near the grave. And in the top corner, you see a beautiful copper alloy button, which was also found in close proximity. A variety of faunal remains were also collected, and this includes Tamar wallaby bone. Now, I want to point out that wallabies are not native to Beacon Island, but they are found on West Wallaby Island, where Webby Hayes and the soldiers were sent. And we do know that the mutineers attacked West Wallaby 3 times, so they were visiting that island. So the wallaby bones found on Beacon Island actually suggests that somebody visited West Wallaby and returned to Beacon. So it's possible that a mutineer or mutineers brought wallaby back for food. In 2017, with DGPS and drones in hand, we opened up 3 more trenches. One of these proved slightly more interesting than the others. The upper part of Trench 2 contained 5 individuals, BIB 15 to 19, at a maximum depth of 70 centimeters. And you can see here, I just want to point out that you have these 4 individuals who are parallel to each other and this 5th individual resting at the feet. The excavation and recovery of these 5 individuals revealed a further 2 individuals beneath them, so BIB 20 and 21, and they were found at a maximum depth of 1 meter. But they were not recovered until the following year in 2018. It appears that the mass grave represents 2 separate burial events, as the 2 deeper burials were deliberately covered with sterile soil from the initial burial pit, and then you have those 5 upper bodies added, possibly contemporarily, as those 4 were placed parallel, and then that 5th one strewn across the feet, as I pointed out. The only cultural material found during the 2017 and 18 seasons was a small pewter spoon located at the pelvis of BIB 18, so that's this one here on the right, most likely left in the trouser pockets at the time of burial, and then a gray stoneware jug found adjacent to the grave, just here on your left. So here we can recap what's been excavated on Beacon Island since the late 1990s and where the distribution of burials are across the island. Now, people often ask, why excavate and recover these individuals? Look, it was never the intention necessarily to look for those individuals. I mean, we knew it's part of the story, and considering how many lost their lives, it was inevitable that we would find them. But we are still interested in the cultural heritage remains that help tell that story. But through the advancements in technology, we can now ask so many more broader questions. Like, what was the variation in diet during the life of the people on board Batavia? What was the provenance of the people on board? What can we learn about those individuals who lost their lives? What evidence is there for resistance, survival, and retribution? And is there evidence related to their death that matches historical accounts? Now, hopefully, we will be able to give a voice back to those who lost their lives here. Now, our forensic anthropology partners are looking to see if it's possible to detect a timeline for diet and geographical information per individual. Stable isotopes from carbon and nitrogen from collagen samples, so the dentine and or bone of 12 individuals has been analyzed for dietary reconstruction, and the stable isotopes from strontium and oxygen found in the tooth. So in the tooth enamel itself primarily provides that geographical information. For many, the last year on board the ship, the differences in background, occupation, social standing, and hierarchy on board can be determined by information recorded in the teeth and bones themselves. So if we look back to that first mass grave from the late 1990s, we can look at the enamel from 3 of these individuals. So the teeth were tested. And the first results suggest that we have 3 individuals from various regions in Western Europe. So we've got the UK, France, Germany, and Scandinavia. Now, the isotopic work for the remaining individuals is still ongoing, and we're hoping to continue this work into the coming years. But what we've learned thus far is that the bone and tooth provide quality opportunities for isotopic studies. We've learned that stable isotopes proved useful in determining timelines and reconstructing diets of individuals. And we have learned that foreigners were present on board, which is also in accordance with the archives. So what are the next steps? Look, in closing the excavation of Batavia, we've turned our attention to the terrestrial surviving sites. And over the past 40 years, we've recovered a collection of significant material. Our role now is really to bring these lines of investigation together to provide a meaningful interpretation of not only the material recovered from the shipwreck itself, but also focus on how people lived, as well as investigate how they utilize the resources on the islands. So in terms of the future, the research of recovered materials ongoing. We've got the in situ and ex situ conservation, which continues. And the archaeological work is nowhere near complete, as there are still other islands in the Wallaby Group that have not been fully investigated, not to mention the additional geophysical targets on Beacon Island and West Wallaby, which I've mentioned today. And they've yet to be investigated. So we still have years of work ahead of us. So in short, stay tuned, for the story still has more to offer. And before I open up for questions, I just wanted to acknowledge again that all of the work that I've mentioned today is a collaboration of dozens of individuals, and we just want to acknowledge the work that they've done and say thank you for your time.